I rented an apartment a few years back from a buddy named Mike. He just bought it and had the place completely redone. New floors, fresh paint, everything. He was trying to sell it but hadn't had any luck, so I offered to rent it for a while to help him out. It was a decent deal for me, a spacious one-bedroom in a decent neighborhood, and it gave Mike some breathing room while he tried to unload the property. The building itself was an older brick structure, 3 stories tall, with a shared courtyard in the middle. It was quiet enough, just a few other tenants, mostly families with kids. I was on the 2nd floor, across the hall from an apartment occupied by a woman who looked like she was around 45, but you could tell she'd had a rough life and appeared much older. Her face was etched with worry lines, her hair perpetually frizzy, and she always seemed to wear the same stained house dress. The first few weeks were uneventful. I settled into my routine, unpacked my things, and got acquainted with the neighborhood. But then, the weirdness started creeping in. It began with the noise. Every night, starting around 11, I'd hear her blaring these late-night Christian radio shows, the kind with preachers yelling, wailing music, and testimonies of divine intervention. It wasn't just the volume, but the way she'd talk back to the radio, arguing with the preachers, laughing at the testimonies, and sometimes breaking out into her own ecstatic pronouncements. The noise got so bad that it was impossible to sleep. One night I had enough. The radio was blasting a particularly loud hymn, the woman's voice over the din, a mixture of fervent praise and desperate pleading. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and walked across the hall to her door. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear the radio booming inside. I knocked hesitantly. The woman's voice stopped. Silence. Then, the creak of the door as she cracked it open. Just a sliver. I saw her face, pale and sunken, her eyes wide and unblinking. She didn't say a word, just stared at me. I took a step back, trying to be polite. "Hi," I said. "Could you please keep the noise down? I'm trying to sleep." She didn't react. She just stared at me, her lips slightly parted, as if she was struggling to form a word. It was a strange, unsettling silence. Through the opening, I saw a glimpse inside. The walls were covered in crosses painted in all sorts of colors, and words like God and angels were scribbled everywhere, often overlapping each other in a chaotic mess. The windows were completely blacked out, letting no light in. The smell hit me then, damp air, yellow-stained carpets that looked decades old, cockroach trails, and what seemed like dog poop all over. But there wasn't any dog in sight. I tried to suppress a shudder. The woman finally broke eye contact, slowly closing the door. I could feel her gaze on me as I retreated back to my apartment, a strange, uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. Not even a minute later, the radio cranked up even louder. The woman's voice, high-pitched and shrill, began a passionate monologue, interspersed with bursts of cackling laughter. I could hear her pacing back and forth in her apartment, the floorboards creaking beneath her. Sleep was out of the question. I sat on my bed, feeling the adrenaline coursing through my veins, my mind racing. I thought about calling Mike, about asking him if he knew anything about the woman, but I hesitated. I didn't want to appear weak or overly concerned. The shouting and singing from next door continued for over an hour. Finally, around midnight the sounds died down, replaced by a tense silence. The next day, I told Mike about the woman, the noise, and the glimpse I'd had into her apartment. He chuckled, dismissing it as eccentric. "She's just a little off," he said. "Lives in her own world. She's harmless, but she can get a little loud sometimes. You'll get used to it." I didn't feel reassured. That night, my girlfriend, Sarah, stayed over. We were both exhausted from the previous night, and we fell asleep quickly. But I woke up around 3 in the morning, a chill running down my spine. There was a dark figure standing right next to our bed, just staring at us. At first, I thought I was just groggy and seeing things. I rubbed my eyes, blinking hard, but the figure was still there. It was the woman from next door. Her face was pale, her eyes glittering in the darkness. She was holding something in her hand, a cylindrical object that shimmered faintly in the moonlight coming through the window. I could make out the shape. It was a power drill. I started to panic. My voice caught in my throat. What? I stammered. She didn't respond. She just kept staring at us. Finally, she spoke, her voice a low, raspy whisper. You should really lock your door at night, she said, her eyes boring into mine. Then, she turned around and walked out like it was nothing. Sarah stirred in her sleep, mumbling something incoherent. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, my heart pounding in my chest. The image of the woman, the power drill, her chilling words burned into my mind. The next morning, I told Sarah about the incident. She wasn't thrilled, to say the least. We decided to install a security system, just in case. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. That afternoon, I was working at my computer when I heard a strange muttering sound coming from outside my bedroom window. I looked out and saw her crouched down on the ground, babbling in some sort of gibberish, like she was speaking in tongues. She was holding a plastic bag, and inside it was the decaying body of a dog. The smell coming off it was rancid, it was hot outside, and the stench of death hung in the air. The dog was small, maybe a terrier, its fur matted and covered in what looked like dried blood and maggots. This was it. The woman was completely unhinged. I went upstairs and knocked on another neighbor's door to see if they knew what was going on. The guy who answered was just as scared as I was. He told me that she had broken into his apartment one evening while he was watching TV with his kids. He got up to grab a drink from the kitchen, and when he came back, she was standing behind the couch, staring at him with a power drill in her hand. She didn't say anything, he said, his voice trembling. Just stood there, staring. It was like she was waiting for something to happen. At this point, I was losing it. This woman was a threat. I called the cops. They knew all about her. Apparently, she was off her medication and had a history of violent behavior. But they said they couldn't just barge into her place without her permission since she owned the apartment. The best they could do was pick her up when she left the building. I stayed up for the next 2 nights, waiting for her to run out of cigarettes or whatever else she needed. Finally, around 2 a.m., I heard her leave the building to head over to the all-night convenience store across the street. I called the cops right away. Within minutes, 3 squad cars and a special van were there. They restrained her, threw her in the van, and drove off to some institution. In a matter of moments, it was like she'd never even existed. I never saw her again, but I still have nightmares of her standing over me while I slept, watching. The image of her pale face, the power drill, the smell of the decaying dog, the unnerving silence before she spoke. It's a scene that has haunted me for years. The police never found the dog's remains. The owner of the apartment next door moved out a few months later. He told me he wouldn't last another minute in that place. Mike finally managed to sell the apartment, but he never mentioned the woman again. I moved out shortly after, finding a quieter, more peaceful place to live. But the memory of the woman, the chilling encounter in the middle of the night, the eerie silence, and her whispered words, they're things that will stay with me forever. I'm still left with the question, what exactly was she waiting for? What had she planned to do? When I was about 8 years old, something happened that still sends shivers down my spine. It was a typical autumn evening, and I had been playing in my room when my mom asked me to let our dogs in from the backyard. It was already around 9 p.m., and the sky was completely dark. I remember rushing to the back door, flipping on the light, and calling out to our 2 dogs, Bailey and Chloe. Bailey! Chloe! Come on, guys! I called, my voice echoing in the still air. They usually came bounding in, wagging their tails and eager for some indoor cuddles. But tonight they hesitated. I saw them in the flickering light of the porch lamp, their ears perked up, their eyes wide with something akin to fear. Then, as if a sudden gust of wind had swept through the backyard, they bolted inside, almost knocking me over in their haste. I quickly pushed the doors shut and turned the lock, the sound loud and sharp in the quiet house. At that exact moment, the handle on the outside door rattled violently, as if someone was desperately trying to open it. My heart jumped into my throat. Through the glass pane of the door, I could make out the faint outline of a man standing just beyond the light. I couldn't see his face, obscured by the shadows, but I could feel his presence, tall and looming in the darkness. His figure seemed to pulse with an unnerving energy. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, almost frozen with fear. I didn't know what to do. My mind screamed for me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. The rattling of the handle grew more insistent, as if the figure outside was growing impatient. The dogs, sensing my fear, whined and cowered at my feet. Without thinking, I sprinted to find my dad, shouting for him to come quickly. I could hear my mom's voice from the living room, asking what was wrong. But I couldn't stop to explain. I had to get my dad. He burst into the room, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. Before he could ask what was happening, I pointed to the back door. His eyes widened in surprise as he saw the shaking handle and the shadowy outline beyond. Without a second thought, he threw open the door and charged into the backyard. I stood in the doorway, trembling, watching him chase the shadowy figure. The man ran off, disappearing down the road into the night. My dad returned a few minutes later, breathing heavily and his eyes filled with anger. He told me he hadn't gotten a good look at the man, but he had seen the unmistakable glint of a blade in his hand. "He was trying to get in," my dad said, his voice tight with emotion. "I don't know if he meant to hurt you or what, but he was definitely trying to get in." My mom rushed to my side, her arms wrapping around me in a tight embrace. She held me close, her warmth a soothing comfort against my fear. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of the shadowy figure, his form a twisted mockery of a man, was etched into my mind. I kept replaying the scene over and over in my head, the rattle of the handle, the fleeting glimpse of the blade, the cold fear that had frozen me in place. My parents reassured me that it was just a random thing, a troubled individual who probably didn't know what he was doing. They told me it was over, that the man was gone. But I knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The next few weeks passed in a blur of anxiety and unease. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustling leaf outside my window, sent a shiver down my spine. I began to see shadows everywhere. Every dark corner seemed to hold a hidden threat. My parents, sensing my growing fear, tried to distract me. They took me to the movies, bought me my favorite toys, and showered me with hugs and kisses. But nothing could erase the image of the man from my mind. One night, a week after the incident, I was playing in my room when I heard a noise from the backyard. It was a soft sound, a muffled thumping that seemed to come from the direction of the shed. My heart raced. "Dad!" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. My dad rushed into the room, his eyes scanning the room in search of the source of my fear. "What is it, honey?" he asked, his voice calm and reassuring. "I heard something," I said, pointing towards the back door. "It sounded like someone was in the shed." My dad, ever the pragmatist, dismissed my fears. "It's probably just the wind," he said, his hand resting reassuringly on my shoulder. "Go back to playing." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I sat by the window, my eyes glued to the backyard, waiting for the slightest movement, the faintest flicker of a shadow. Then I saw it. A dark figure, shrouded in the shadows, moved behind the shed. It was brief, fleeting, but impossible to mistake. My heart pounded in my chest, a drumbeat of fear. I knew I couldn't stay silent. I had to tell someone. But who would believe me? I found my mom in the kitchen. She was just finishing the dishes, her back to me. "Mom," I said, my voice trembling. "There's something in the backyard." She turned around, her face a mask of concern. "What is it, sweetie?" "I saw him again," I said, pointing towards the back door. "The man from the other night. He's behind the shed." My mom's face changed. The concern melted away, replaced by a chilling coldness. "Don't be silly, honey," she said, her voice sharp and brittle. There's no one out there. But I saw him, I insisted, my voice gaining strength. It was the same man. My mom shook her head, her eyes filled with a strange, unsettling light. You must have imagined it, she said, her voice laced with a chilling lack of tenderness. There's nothing to worry about. I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. Something was wrong. My mother's reaction was off, her words laced with an unnerving detachment. My dad walked into the kitchen, his brow furrowed with worry. What's going on? He asked, his eyes flitting between me and my mom. I started to explain what I had seen, but my mom cut me off. It's nothing, she said, her voice tight and controlled. Just a little girl's imagination running wild. My dad looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and confusion. Are you sure you didn't just imagine it, honey? He asked. I tried to explain, but my words seemed to get lost in the air. My mom was watching me, her gaze unwavering, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. The next day, my parents told me they were taking me to visit my grandmother. They said she had been feeling lonely and could use some company. I was excited. I loved visiting my grandma, her house filled with the comforting scent of cookies and the soft patter of rain on the window. But as we drove away from the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My mom's behavior had been strange, her words sharp and aloof. And my dad seemed lost, his eyes filled with a strange, undefined anxiety. The drive was quiet, punctuated only by the occasional soft hum of the radio. I stared out the window, watching the countryside fly by, my mind racing with a million thoughts. When we arrived at my grandmother's house, I was greeted with a warm embrace and a plate of freshly baked cookies. She was thrilled to see me, her eyes lighting up with a smile. But something about her seemed different. Her movements were slower, her words slurred, her eyes filled with a vacant stare. Grandma? I asked, my voice a whisper. Are you okay? Her eyes met mine, and a wave of icy fear washed over me. There was something wrong, something very wrong. Her eyes held a chilling emptiness, a cold, lifeless stare that sent a shiver down my spine. Of course, darling, she said, her voice a raspy whisper. Her words sounded distant, as if spoken from a great distance. I'm just so glad you're here. The days that followed were a blur of unsettling events. My grandma seemed to grow weaker by the day, her movements becoming more erratic, her words more incoherent. The food she served me seemed to have a strange, metallic taste that left a tingling sensation on my tongue. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a noise from downstairs. It was a soft, scraping sound, as if someone was dragging something heavy across the floorboards. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. My grandma's house was old, the floorboards creaking with every step. But something about this noise felt different, more sinister. I crept out of bed and tiptoed to the top of the stairs. The noise was louder now, a scraping, clanging sound that seemed to be coming from the kitchen. I peered over the railing. The kitchen was dark, only a sliver of moonlight illuminating the room. I could see a dark figure moving in the shadows, its movements slow and deliberate. Grandma? I called out, my voice barely a whisper. The figure turned, its face obscured in the darkness. But I could see the faint outline of a man's form, the same figure I had seen behind the shed, the same figure that had rattled my back door. The man's face was a mask of shadows. I couldn't see his eyes, his features. Just the dark outline of a man, his form twisted and unnatural. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice a low, guttural growl. You shouldn't be here at all. I froze, my body paralyzed by fear. The figure moved towards me, its shadow lengthening in the moonlight. I knew I had to run. I sprinted down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the man's heavy footsteps behind me, the sound of his scrabbling claws on the wooden floorboards. I burst through the front door and into the night. I ran as fast as I could, the cold air biting at my lungs. I ran and ran, until my legs felt like jelly and my lungs burned. But I didn't stop. I knew the man was chasing me, his dark form a looming shadow in the moonlight. I finally collapsed in a heap by the side of the road, my body exhausted. I lay there, gasping for breath, my eyes darting around, waiting for the man to appear. But he didn't come. The next morning, I found myself back home, my parents sitting on the couch, their faces drawn and their eyes filled with an unreadable emotion. "Where were you last night?" my mom asked, her voice cold and emotionless. "I was at Grandma's," I whispered, my voice small and trembling. My dad shook his head. "That's impossible," he said. "We were with your grandmother all night. She's gone." "Gone?" I repeated, my voice a mere whisper. "Yes, gone," my mom said, her eyes filled with a strange, unsettling light. "She's gone, and you're lucky you didn't go with her." My parents told me that my grandmother had died in her sleep. They said her death was a peaceful one, a natural end to a long and fulfilling life. But I knew the truth. I knew that my grandmother was not dead. I knew that she was gone, taken by the same man who had tried to break into my home, the same man who had lurked in the shadows behind the shed. I knew that this wasn't over. I knew that he was still out there, waiting, watching. And I knew that I was not safe. From that day forward, I have never felt truly safe. The man who tried to get into my home, the man who took my grandmother away, became a constant presence in my life. A shadow lurking in the corners of my mind, a fear that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. I live with the knowledge that he is out there somewhere, waiting for his next victim. And I know, deep down, that he will find us again. The man from the shadows. He will find us. During a night shift at a massive warehouse, I found myself in the break room with a few colleagues, battling to keep our eyes open. The hum of machinery and the dim glow of fluorescent lights were the only constants in the otherwise eerie stillness of the night. To pass the time, we engaged in mundane chatter about past jobs, trying to keep our minds off the mounting fatigue. It was then that an older worker, who had spent more than 3 decades at the warehouse, decided to join the conversation. He had always been a silent figure, keeping to himself and never contributing much to our discussions. However, on that fateful night, he began sharing an unsettling story that left us all aghast. The man, who appeared to be in his 60s, had a haunted look in his eyes as he delved deep into his past. His tale was from his time working as an aide at a nursing home. At first, it seemed like a typical story of a young man finding his way through the world and dealing with the trials and tribulations that came with it. But then, the narrative took a dark turn that none of us could have anticipated. He revealed that during his tenure at the nursing home, he had engaged in sexual relations with several elderly female residents. The disturbing part was that some of these women were physically disabled and utterly dependent on the staff for their daily needs. He spoke of his nightly encounters with a boastful pride that sent shivers down my spine. One particular resident stood out in his twisted account. She was afflicted with a nerve disorder that left her unable to speak, yet the old man interpreted her physical responses as signs of her affection towards him. He spoke with a strange reverence about the time he spent with her, describing it as if he had found himself in some kind of sick paradise, reveling in the power he held over the vulnerable women in his care. Unable to fathom the depths of his depravity, I listened in stunned silence as he spoke of this poor woman, whose only means of communication was her involuntary responses to his abhorrent advances. I wanted to believe that I had misheard him, that there must be some misunderstanding. But the longer he spoke, the more it became clear that this was no misunderstanding, but rather a calculated pattern of predatory behavior on his part. As he continued his disturbing monologue, I glanced at my colleagues. Their faces reflected the same horror and disbelief that I felt. Yet, we all remained silent, unwilling or unable to interrupt the flow of his vile words. We knew that we were in the presence of a predator, one who had clearly reveled in the suffering of his victims for far too long. The man never did reveal why he had left the nursing home, but it was clear that his departure was not a voluntary one. I could only hope that justice had caught up to him, that the lives he had destroyed had found some semblance of peace and closure after his departure. Long after he had left us, the conversation in the break room resumed, but it was never the same. A pall had been cast over the group, and we all found ourselves unable to shake the haunting images that had been conjured up by the old man's words. I wondered how many other lives had been marred by his actions, how many other victims had suffered in silence, unable to escape the clutches of their tormentor. As I clocked out and stepped out into the cool night air, I couldn't help but think about the man's tale, and the implications it held. Was it possible that the women in the nursing home had been willing participants, or had they been coerced into silence by his predatory behavior? I knew that I would never have a definitive answer, but the very thought of their suffering weighed heavily on my heart. I spent the following days trying to make sense of the man's story, scouring the internet for any scrap of information that might shine a light on his past. To my surprise, I managed to find a few news articles detailing a string of sexual misconduct allegations against a man fitting his description, working at a nursing home. The articles painted a chilling picture, one that perfectly mirrored the story he had shared in the break room. Though I knew that I had never been a direct victim of his actions, I couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility. I had stood by in silence as he had regaled us with his sickening tales, never once considering the true nature of his words. I vowed never to let such a thing happen again, to speak up and listen with compassion whenever I sensed that someone was in need. But the weight of his revelation stayed with me, a constant reminder of the darkness that was all too present in our world. His story was a sobering reminder of the importance of empathy and understanding, and of our duty to protect the most vulnerable among us. As I continued to work the night shift, the warehouse seemed a little less intimidating, and a little less lonely. I found solace in the knowledge that I was not alone in my struggles, that there were others who had faced far greater challenges and found a way to persevere. My thoughts often drifted back to the man, and I wondered if our paths would ever cross again. I hoped that he had found some measure of redemption, that he had come to terms with the weight of his past actions. I knew that such a transformation would not be easy, but I held on to the belief that everyone had the capacity for change, no matter how challenging the journey may be. As the nights turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I began to notice a change in my colleagues. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The haunted looks in their eyes began to fade, replaced by a determination, a willingness to stand up and face the challenges of the night shift head-on. We started to speak more openly about our lives and experiences, forging connections that went beyond the confines of our workplace. We became not just colleagues, but a community, united by the knowledge that we were all in this together. The old man's story, as horrifying as it had been, had served a purpose. It had brought us closer together, and had taught us the importance of listening, of standing up for what is right, and of protecting the most vulnerable among us. It is a lesson that I will carry with me for the rest of my life, a reminder of the power that lies in words, and the responsibility that we all have to wield that power with compassion and understanding. One day, as I walked through the warehouse, I noticed that the old man was no longer there. I could only hope that he had found the peace and closure that had long eluded him, and that he was finally able to leave his dark past behind him. In the end, I was grateful for the experience, for the lessons it had taught me, and for the opportunity to grow as a person, to become more aware of the world around me, and of my place in it. The night shift would always be a challenging, sometimes lonely, chapter in my life, but it was also one that had been filled with moments of beauty, hope, and camaraderie. For that, I would always be grateful. And so, as I continued on my journey, I took the old man's story with me, a reminder of the darkness that lay dormant within us all, but also of the light that was there, if only we dared to look for it. I was driving down a back road, the asphalt gleaming under the moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that always made me feel a little uneasy. It was close to 2 a.m., and I was on my way to pick up my friend, Sarah, from a cabin party about 40 miles west of where I lived. My phone had died earlier that night, and Sarah had forgotten to tell me the exact location of the cabin, leaving me to navigate the unfamiliar roads by the faint glow of my car's headlights. The map on my phone was useless without a signal, so I was relying on vague directions that Sarah had sent me earlier. The road wound through dense forest, the trees pressing close to the asphalt, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The darkness was almost palpable, punctuated only by the occasional flicker of a distant porch light or the distant howl of a coyote. As I rounded a sharp bend, my headlights illuminated a scene that sent a shiver down my spine. A red four-door sedan was parked on the shoulder, all four doors wide open. Inside, four figures were slumped in their seats, their heads slumped over, as if they had fallen asleep mid-conversation. It was an unsettling sight, and for a moment, I froze, my foot hovering over the brake pedal. My heart pounded in my chest, a drum against my ribs. My first instinct was to keep driving, but something stopped me. It felt wrong. Cautiously, I pulled over a safe distance away and turned off my headlights. The only light now came from the moon and the faint glow of the dashboard. I watched the car, my breath catching in my throat. The figures remained motionless, like mannequins frozen in a macabre tableau. I was torn between fear and a morbid curiosity. Suddenly, the driver's side door creaked open and a figure emerged, their back hunched, their movements slow and deliberate. I could barely make out their features in the dim light. The figure walked towards my car, their face a mask of shadows. My pulse quickened. I was about to bolt, to slam the car into gear and flee, but something held me back. I had to know what was going on. I rolled down the window a crack and called out, "Hello? Is everything all right?" There was no response. The figure stood at the edge of my headlights, their form indistinct, their silent presence radiating an unnerving aura. I felt a cold hand grip my heart, and I knew I had to get out of there. I quickly reversed, my tires spitting gravel on the asphalt, and sped away down the dark road. My mind raced, adrenaline surging through my veins. What had I just seen? What had that figure been doing? Were they injured? Were they dead? I couldn't shake the image of the car, the limp figures, the silent figure approaching my car. It was like a scene from a horror movie, a nightmare come to life. The drive, which had already felt unsettling, turned into a torturous journey, each bend in the road a potential hiding place for more horrors. I finally found Sarah's cabin party, a small gathering of friends huddled around a crackling bonfire, oblivious to the disturbing scene I had just witnessed. Relief washed over me as I joined the group, the warmth of their laughter and the flickering flames momentarily erasing the chilling image from my mind. But the memory lingered, a dark cloud hanging over the otherwise pleasant evening. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone about the car, the figures, the eerie encounter. They would dismiss it as a figment of my imagination, a trick of the night. But I knew it was real. It was close to 3 a.m. when I finally decided to leave. I said my goodbyes and headed back to my car, the darkness of the forest pressing in on me like a suffocating blanket. As I drove, I couldn't help but check my rearview mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. The road was empty, the trees casting long, menacing shadows. Then I saw it. The red four-door sedan was parked on the side of the road, just a few miles from the cabin. This time, only the front passenger door was open, and the car was bathed in the ethereal light of the moon. I slowed down, my foot barely grazing the brake pedal. Inside, the figures sat upright, their heads turned towards me, their faces illuminated by the moonlight. They stared at me, their eyes wide and unblinking, their expressions blank, emotionless, devoid of life. The sight of their vacant stares, their ghostly stillness, sent a wave of pure terror crashing over me. I slammed the accelerator, my car roaring to life, and sped away. The image of the car, the figures, their vacant stares, continued to haunt me, a chilling reminder of the night I encountered the uncanny. The fear that night was real, and it continued to linger, a constant presence in the back of my mind. I returned to that road several times, hoping to find an explanation, to understand what I had seen. Each time, the car was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. The mystery of the car, the figures, their vacant stares, remains unsolved. It haunts me still, A chilling reminder that the darkness can hold secrets that even the brightest moon cannot illuminate.